In a world long before language, before stories, before even the idea of history itself, human life was shaped by something far more immediate: survival, silence, and instinct. Every decision meant life or death. Every sound in the dark could mean danger. And yet, somewhere inside that silence, something extraordinary was beginning to form. Thought without words, memory without writing, meaning without language. Before words' life, thought and survival in prehistory is a journey back into that forgotten world where the first human minds began to recognize patterns, share intentions, and slowly build the foundations of everything we are today. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps keep these long-form history journeys going and brings you more stories from the distant human past. Now, step back to a time before words existed and watch how thought itself begins to awaken. Dawn does not arrive cleanly in prehistory. It seeps in through smoke, through ash carried on wind, through the slow heat of a small fire struggling against a vast and indifferent landscape. Somewhere in this world that has no names yet, a line of early humans moves through broken terrain, low hills worn down by time, riverbeds shifting without warning, forests that feel less like shelter and more like an uncertain boundary between safety and disappearance. There is no language here in the way it will later be understood. Only patterns are paused when the wind changes, a tightening of grip around a sharpened stone, a shared stillness when distant movement disturbs the grass. Survival is not a system yet. It is a set of reactions refined by countless failures that left no trace except absence. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The earliest known hominins do not live in a world shaped by human intention. The land dominates everything. Weather is not a condition to be forecast, but a force that decides movement, hunger, and death. Water sources are not managed or mapped. They are discovered, lost, and rediscovered in cycles that span generations. In this environment, intelligence is not measured by invention alone, but by endurance, the ability to remain present in a world that constantly removes certainty. Yet even here, something subtle begins to emerge. It is not thought as modern minds would recognize it. But it is not pure instinct either. It sits in between, like a shadow forming behind action. A hand does not merely pick up a stone. It weighs it, turns it, tests its edge against bone or wood. A group does not simply follow animals. It learns their rhythms, their hesitation at water, their fear of open ground. These are not yet theories. They are repeated observations, slowly accumulating into something that begins to resemble understanding. Fire, when it appears in this world, is not owned. It is endured. At first, it arrives from lightning strikes or natural burns, unpredictable and dangerous. Early humans approach it cautiously, learning its behavior in fragments. It consumes, but it also preserves warmth when night becomes an enemy. It repels predators that rule the darkness. Around it, something changes in the group dynamic. Attention gathers. Waiting becomes shared, and in that shared waiting, something like early focus begins to form a precursor to reflection. What is often overlooked in the archaeological record is not just the tools themselves, but the patience behind them. Stone flakes shaped by repeated strikes reveal not only intention, but correction. A mistake is not discarded immediately, it is adjusted. A sharper edge is not an accident alone, but the result of incremental refinement. This suggests a mind capable of holding an outcome in memory long enough to pursue it across multiple attempts. It is not language, but it is already structure. The landscapes these early humans inhabit are unstable in ways that modern perception struggles to reconstruct. Ice advances and retreats over vast spans of time. Rivers carve new paths without warning. Animal migrations shift unpredictably with climate fluctuations. In such a world, survival depends on noticing what others might overlook: the subtle change in wind direction that signals seasonal shift, the faint difference in plant growth that indicates underground water, the distant movement of herds long before they become visible. Groups remain small, not by choice, but by constraint. Larger gatherings would collapse under resource pressure. Every member matters not only for labor, but for memory. One individual remembers where a fruitful patch of roots was found. Another recalls the behavior of predators in a particular valley. This distributed memory becomes a living archive, fragile yet essential. If one person dies, a fragment of the world's knowledge disappears with them. And yet, even in this fragile existence, patterns begin to stabilize. Certain places are returned to repeatedly. Certain tools become standard rather than experimental. Certain behaviors, sharing food, protecting fire, staying close during rest, become habitual. These habits are not written, but they persist across generations through imitation alone. What emerges is not culture in its later complexity, but its earlier skeleton. The mind behind these actions is still largely invisible to us. Archaeology can recover tools, fire remnants, animal bones marked by cutting. It can suggest movement and diet, but it cannot directly recover the interior experience of those who made these choices. Still, something can be inferred. The repeated refinement of tools implies anticipation. The controlled use of fire implies foresight. The organization of space around activity implies a developing sense of environment as something structured, not random. In rare moments, the record becomes almost suggestive of awareness that extends beyond immediate survival. Objects are sometimes carried far from their geological source, indicating value beyond utility. Certain materials are preferred even when less abundant. These choices hint at perception shaped not only by necessity, but by preference, a subtle but important step toward symbolic thought. What remains most striking is how slowly all of this unfolds. There is no sudden leap into intelligence, no single moment of awakening. Instead, there is accumulation, small refinements layered over thousands of generations, each one barely visible on its own, yet collectively reshaping what it means to be human in the most fundamental sense. And somewhere within this long, quiet accumulation, the earliest foundations of awareness begin to take shape, not as words, not as stories, but as recognition that the world can be observed, learned from, and subtly influenced. The ground has not yet been named, but it is already being understood. In the quiet stretch of prehistory where survival has already become routine, something far less visible begins to take shape. It does not appear in the landscape, and it does not leave a mark in stone. It exists only in the pattern of responses, how certain individuals pause before acting, how attention lingers longer than necessity requires, how a sequence of steps is mentally rehearsed before the body commits to them. This is the earliest suggestion of what might be called the first minds. Not minds in the modern sense, shaped by language and abstraction, but something more tentative, a cognitive space forming between perception and action, where the world is no longer only reacted to, but briefly held, examined, and adjusted internally before being engaged. It is an almost imperceptible shift, yet it changes everything that follows. In these early groups, behavior begins to show subtle divergence. Two individuals faced with the same challenge do not always respond in identical ways. One reacts immediately to a threat or opportunity. Another hesitates, observing longer, as if comparing present conditions to something remembered. That delay is important. It suggests that experience is no longer vanishing the moment it passes. It is being stored, however imperfectly, and retrieved to influence the present. Memory, in this sense, is not a library. It is more like sediment. Layers of experience accumulate unevenly, sometimes distorted, sometimes incomplete, but still capable of shaping future behavior. A successful hunt is not just satisfaction, it becomes a template. A dangerous encounter is not just fear, it becomes avoidance encoded into future movement. Over time, these layers begin to form a primitive internal map of the world. The world itself, in turn, becomes more structured in perception. Where earlier hominins may have experienced environment as a continuous field of stimuli, early humans begin to divide it into zones of meaning, safe and unsafe, familiar and unknown, resource-rich and barren. These distinctions are not labeled, but they are acted upon consistently enough that they begin to define movement across space. What is emerging here is not yet language, but categorization, the ability to treat different experiences as belonging to different kinds of things. This is a critical step because it allows for comparison, and comparison is the foundation of abstraction. Archaeological evidence cannot directly reveal these internal processes, but it offers indirect signals. Repetition in tool-making, for example, suggests more than mechanical imitation. It suggests that an outcome is being mentally retained as a reference point. A sharpened edge is not recreated randomly each time. It is approximated, adjusted, corrected. That implies an internal model, however simple, of what better means. Even more intriguing are signs of variability in the same cultural groups. Tools from a single site are not always uniform. Some are refined beyond immediate necessity, shaped with a precision that exceeds functional requirement. These objects raise a quiet but persistent question when survival demands only adequacy. Why invest effort in refinement? One possible answer lies in anticipation, the ability to imagine not only what is needed now, but what might be needed later. A sharper tool than required today becomes preparation for uncertainty. This kind of thinking does not require language, but it does require temporal displacement, the ability to mentally step outside the immediate present. That displacement is one of the defining thresholds of cognition. At the same time, social awareness is also deepening. Individuals are not only responding to the environment, but to each other. Patterns of cooperation suggest recognition of roles within the group. Some individuals consistently participate in hunting. Others focus on gathering. Others remain closer to fire or shelter, perhaps due to age, experience, or injury. These roles are not assigned formally, but they persist through repeated interaction. Within these repeated interactions, early forms of prediction emerge. One individual learns how another is likely to respond in a given situation. This is not empathy in the modern sense, but it is the beginning of behavioral modeling, the ability to anticipate action based on past observation. Such modeling increases group stability, reduces conflict, and improves collective survival. In rare and fragmentary moments, something even more unusual appears in the record. Certain sites show evidence of objects arranged in ways that serve no direct survival function. Stones placed in deliberate patterns, pigments applied not to tools, but to surfaces. These actions suggest attention directed not only at utility, but at representation. Representation is a profound cognitive leap. It means that something can stand for something else. A mark can refer to an object, a place, or even an idea. At this stage, the meaning behind such acts remains speculative. Scholars still debate whether these were early symbolic gestures, ritual behaviors, or simple byproducts of repeated actions. No single explanation fully accounts for all evidence. What is clear, however, is that attention is beginning to detach slightly from immediate function. The world is no longer only acted upon, it is also being reflected upon, however dimly. This reflection is not verbal, it is spatial, tactile, and visual. It exists in the arrangement of objects, in the selection of materials, in the repetition of certain forms. Fire, once merely a tool for survival, begins to occupy a more complex role in this evolving cognitive landscape. Around it, groups do not simply gather for warmth or safety, they remain longer than necessary. Activity slows, observation increases. The flickering movement of flame provides a focus point that is neither object nor living being, yet holds attention in a sustained way. This sustained attention may have played a quiet but significant role in the development of early reflective thought. As these cognitive abilities expand, even slightly, they begin to reshape survival itself. A group capable of anticipating seasonal changes can move earlier, securing better resources. A group capable of remembering dangerous terrain can avoid unnecessary loss. A group capable of modeling each other's behavior can coordinate more effectively during hunts. Each improvement is small on its own, but together they create a feedback loop between cognition and survival. And within that loop, the first minds continue to deepen not suddenly, not uniformly, but gradually, like a landscape being reshaped by invisible forces acting over vast time. What is taking form here is not yet humanity as it will later be defined. It is something more tentative, more experimental, a species beginning to carry the world not only in its senses, but in its memory. And once a world can be remembered, it can begin, however faintly, to be reimagined. The world of early humans does not reward intelligence in the abstract. It rewards timing, precision, and the ability to endure uncertainty long enough for opportunity to reveal itself. Every decision carries weight measured not in consequence alone, but in survival itself. In this landscape, survival is not a background condition. It is the central structure around which all cognition is shaped. Hunger arrives without warning and does not negotiate. It compresses thought into urgency. A group that fails to anticipate seasonal scarcity does not adapt slowly. It disappears. What remains in the archaeological record are only the traces of those who managed to stay just ahead of collapse. Within this pressure, survival becomes a form of strategy long before it becomes a concept. Early hominin groups move through environments that are constantly shifting between abundance and absence. A valley rich in game one season may become empty the next. Plant resources fluctuate with rainfall, soil conditions, and temperature cycles that are not predictable in any modern sense. To remain alive in such a system requires more than reaction. It requires pattern recognition stretched across time. And so behavior begins to organize itself around observation. A successful hunt is never just an isolated event. It becomes a reference point, the direction of wind, the behavior of prey before movement, the spacing of animals within a herd. All of it is silently recorded in memory, not as language, but as embodied recall. When similar conditions appear again, bodies respond with adjustments refined by previous outcomes. What emerges is a form of intelligence embedded in action itself. Stone tools provide some of the clearest evidence of this developing strategic mind. A flake struck from a core is not simply a piece of sharp rock. It is the result of controlled force, angle, and intention. Over time, these tools become more standardized in certain regions, suggesting that knowledge of their production is being preserved and transmitted. Transmission is critical here. Knowledge that exists only within a single mind dies with that mind. But when repeated actions are observed and imitated, knowledge begins to move across individuals. This is not teaching in the modern sense. It is repetition under observation, correction through proximity, and gradual alignment of technique. In this way, survival knowledge becomes collective. Hunting strategies reveal an even more complex layer of planning. Large animals, especially herd species, are not easily approached. Successful hunts often require coordination driving prey toward natural barriers, anticipating escape routes, and positioning individuals in roles that increase overall success. Even without formal instruction, groups begin to develop shared patterns of movement that function like early tactical systems. There is no language required for this coordination. There is shared attention, shared expectation, and shared response. A movement in one direction triggers movement in others. Over time, these patterns stabilize into repeatable strategies. Yet not all survival is active. Much of it is passive, embedded in restraint. Knowing when not to act becomes as important as knowing how to act. Premature pursuit can scatter prey. Misjudging weather can trap a group in exposed terrain. Approaching unfamiliar animals or landscapes without caution can lead to fatal encounters. This restraint suggests a growing ability to simulate outcomes mentally before committing physically. Such simulation does not require words. It requires imagination in its most basic form, the ability to picture a consequence that has not yet occurred and adjust behavior accordingly. Evidence of this cognitive depth is indirect but compelling. Sites show repeated return to successful hunting grounds, indicating spatial memory extended across seasons. Bone accumulations reveal selective targeting of certain species at certain times, suggesting awareness of migratory or behavioral cycles. Even toolware patterns indicate adaptation to specific tasks rather than generalized use. All of this points to a mind that is not merely reacting to environment, but continuously updating its understanding of it. Resource sharing within groups adds another dimension to this survival strategy. Food is not always consumed by the individual who acquires it. In many cases, distribution occurs within the group, especially when immediate consumption exceeds individual need or when others are unable to hunt. This redistribution is not charity in a moral sense. It is survival insurance. By sharing resources, groups reduce volatility. A successful hunter today may fail tomorrow. A non-hunter today may contribute in other ways later. This balancing of risk strengthens group cohesion and increases long-term survival probability. But it also requires recognition of delayed reciprocity, the understanding that value exists beyond immediate exchange. This is a subtle but important cognitive shift. It allows cooperation to extend beyond direct, immediate benefit. Environmental pressures continue to refine these behaviors. Climate fluctuations, glacial advances, and shifting ecosystems force repeated adaptation. Groups that fail to adjust vanish without trace. Those that survive do so by refining not only their tools, but their understanding of time itself. Seasons become meaningful cycles. Animal movements become predictable rhythms. resource availability becomes a structured expectation rather than random chance. In this process, the world becomes less chaotic in perception, even if it remains unchanged in reality. Order is not imposed externally. It is constructed internally through repeated experience. What is most striking is how much of this intelligence remains invisible in the material record. Stone and bone can preserve tools and activity, but they cannot preserve hesitation, planning, or shared anticipation. Yet these invisible elements are precisely what made survival possible. Every successful group carries within it an accumulated memory of failures that no longer exist. Every adaptive behavior is shaped by countless invisible losses. And within this accumulation, survival ceases to be merely biological. It becomes cognitive, a slow refinement of thought under pressure, shaping not only how humans live, but how they begin to perceive the world they're trying to remain within. The landscape is no longer just endured, it is being read. Survival alone does not exhaust the capacities emerging in these early humans. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, practical intelligence extends into the realm of environment manipulation. Shelter is no longer merely a place to rest. It becomes a site of planning, experimentation, and even expression. The first dwellings, lean-tos of branches, simple enclosures, shallow rock overhangs adapted for warmth, suggest deliberate choices about materials, orientation, and placement. These are not random acts of convenience. They reflect a nascent understanding of cause and effect, of microclimates, of protection against both predator and storm. Pigments begin to appear, scattered fragments of ochre or charcoal, often in locations where their function seems unrelated to survival. In some caves, these pigments are ground into powder, applied to surfaces, or carried across significant distances. The practical purpose is unclear. Scholars still debate whether they were used for body decoration, signaling within the group, or early symbolic marking of space. What is undeniable is that the mind capable of transporting and transforming materials for reasons beyond immediate utility is moving into abstraction. Marks on stone and bone, initially incidental, start to show regularity, repeated incisions, geometric arrangements, and deliberate scoring hint at cognition experimenting with representation. These are not letters or numbers, but they are evidence that humans are beginning to externalize thought, to create tangible forms that reflect internal patterns. A carefully struck flake or an incised line on a bone is simultaneously functional and conceptual, both tool and token, practical and expressive. These earlier symbolic gestures often coexist with purely functional artifacts. A sharp flint is simultaneously a weapon and a testament to the maker's skill. It embodies both immediate survival and an unspoken mastery of the craft. The duality of use and representation begins to blur the boundary between action and thought, between doing and meaning. The first dwellings amplify this complexity. Their construction reflects temporal foresight, the understanding that effort invested today can yield future security. Placement is not random overhangs protect against rain, wind, and sun. Elevated platforms keep inhabitants safe from flooding and smaller predators. The selection of materials is strategic, flexible branches that bend without breaking, rocks that accumulate warmth, leaves that insulate against cold. These decisions indicate a growing awareness of the environment as a manipulable space, rather than merely a backdrop to action. Fire, too, becomes an agent of cognitive development beyond survival. Sustaining fire over days or weeks requires planning, resource collection, and maintenance, as well as vigilance. Around it, social dynamics emerge, positioning individuals to maintain the flame. dividing labor for fuel collection, and observing the behavior of other group members. This shared responsibility fosters early social norms, informal hierarchies, and possibly even the beginnings of leadership or role specialization. Fire is not only warmth, it is a focal point for cognition, attention, and interaction. Pigments and incisions hint at emergent symbolic awareness, but they also suggest experimentation. Not every mark survives. Not every color persists. The process of selection, what is carried, what is repeated, what is discarded, implies an internal criterion, an aesthetic or cognitive filter shaping the material world to reflect the mind within. Even the seemingly arbitrary arrangement of stones or pigment can be interpreted as rehearsal in abstract thinking, a rehearsal for more complex mental representation that will come later. The persistence of these behaviors across space and time demonstrates continuity. Groups return to the same sites, often leaving similar marks, tools, and arrangements. This repetition suggests memory extended across generations, not necessarily through spoken words, but through observed practice. Habits become cultural scaffolds small, subtle acts that collectively encode knowledge and perception. The externalized patterns, tools, pigments, shelters serve as a tangible record of abstract thought in action, a precursor to the eventual formalization of symbols and communication. Even spatial organization in shelters reflects cognitive planning. Sleeping areas are often set apart from activity zones. Fire pits occupy central positions. Work surfaces, hunting tools, and food residues reveal consistent placement. These patterns indicate not just survival efficiency, but a proto-concept of order, hierarchy, and designated function. The group begins to negotiate not only the external environment, but the structure of shared living space itself. Early humans are, in effect, creating miniature landscapes of cognition within the broader landscape of nature. Evidence of intentional arrangement is rare, fragmentary, yet striking. It implies that human thought is not solely reactive. It begins to anticipate, to encode intention, to shape both present action and future possibility. A piece of ochre moved miles from its source, a hearth maintained through changing seasons. A carved bone preserved. These small acts are signals of emerging abstraction. They reflect thought that is not only operational but reflective, examining the world and its own processes. The convergence of survival, tool use, and symbolic expression illustrates a profound transition. Humans are beginning to conceptualize the world not simply as a field of obstacles and opportunities, but as a system with patterns, contingencies, and manipulable elements. Observation extends beyond the immediate and tangible. Memory, imagination, and foresight begin to intertwine with action. Early dwellings, fire management, and material marking are all evidence of cognition stretching beyond instinct into deliberate planning and representation. And within this expansion, humans encounter an important paradox. They are still utterly vulnerable to the world they are beginning to comprehend. Storms, predators, scarcity, disease all remain immediate and unrelenting forces. The mind is developing, but mortality does not pause. Each innovative act carries both risk and reward. The emergence of abstract thinking is inseparable from the pressures of survival. It is forged in necessity, refined through repetition, and glimpsed only indirectly through the artifacts left behind. The first dwellings, the pigments, and the incised objects are not just primitive structures or decorations. They are the earliest traces of a mind reaching beyond the immediate, shaping a reality that will eventually support language, culture, and memory itself. Each survival act, each mark, each careful arrangement contributes to the scaffolding upon which later cognition and communication will be built. In these quiet, precarious moments, humanity's first deliberate engagement with abstraction emerges, nestled within the urgent, untamed landscape of survival. At some point in the long drift of prehistory, survival stops being only an individual burden and becomes something shared in a more structured way, not through formal systems or defined rules, but through repeated proximity, repeated observation, and repeated necessity. Humans begin to exist not just beside one another, but through one another. Communication, in its earliest form, emerges from this pressure. It does not begin with words. It begins with attention. In groups moving across unstable landscapes, awareness of others becomes as important as awareness of the environment. A shift in posture signals intent. A change in pace signals urgency. A glance toward a distant movement draws collective focus without any need for articulation. These subtle exchanges form a kind of pre-language, where meaning is carried in timing, gesture, and shared context rather than sound or syntax. The archaeological record cannot preserve these moments directly, yet their consequences are visible. Coordinated behavior appears more frequently. Hunting strategies require synchronized movement. Resource gathering becomes distributed across individuals who later reconvene with shared outcomes. Even shelter organization reflects an increasing sensitivity to group dynamics rather than purely individual need. Within these interactions, gesture becomes central, a hand extended toward a direction, a body angled toward danger, a pause held too long to be accidental. These actions begin to function as signals, not fixed in meaning, but understood through repetition. A gesture does not mean one thing universally. It means what the group has learned it means in context. Meaning is fluid, negotiated, and reinforced through shared experience. This fluidity is important. It suggests that communication is not invented fully formed, but assembled gradually from existing behavioral patterns. Early humans do not create language in a single leap. They refine interaction until it becomes reliable enough to carry intention across individuals. Sound, too, plays a growing role. Vocalizations that once served purely emotional or instinctive functions begin to acquire structure through repetition and association. A specific sound may become linked with warning. Another may be associated with gathering. These associations are not yet language, but they represent a critical step, the binding of sound to shared meaning. What distinguishes this stage from earlier forms of animal communication is flexibility. The same group can adapt signals depending on circumstance. Meaning is not fixed in biology alone. It is shaped by collective agreement, however informal. This adaptability is the seed of linguistic potential. In parallel, social structures begin to subtly organize themselves around reliability. Certain individuals become more trusted in specific contexts not through formal authority, but through demonstrated consistency. A successful hunter may not lead in every situation, but their movements during pursuit may be followed more closely. Someone with strong environmental memory may influence group direction without explicit instruction. Leadership, in this sense, is situational and distributed. These dynamics reduce chaos within group movement. Decisions do not require full consensus. They emerge from alignment, where individuals adjust behavior based on perceived competence and situational awareness. Over time, these patterns stabilize into predictable social flows, improving group survival in complex environments. There is also an emotional dimension developing beneath these interactions. Recognition of others as persistent presences rather than temporary collaborators begins to shape behavior. Loss, avoidance, protection, and proximity take on deeper weight. While we must be cautious not to project modern emotional frameworks onto prehistoric life, the evidence suggests increasing social cohesion beyond immediate utility. Shared fire spaces likely play a crucial role in this development. Around controlled flames, individuals remain in close proximity for extended periods. This enforced stillness encourages observation of others in non-action contexts. In such settings, subtle behaviors become more visible patterns of rest, injury, recovery, and interaction. Over time, familiarity deepens not only through shared labor, but through shared pause. It is in these moments of pause that communication begins to detach slightly from immediate function. A gesture may be repeated not only to direct action, but to reinforce understanding. A sound may be made not only to warn, but to maintain group cohesion. The boundary between utility and expression begins to blur. Archaeological evidence of this transition is indirect but compelling. Group sites show increasing complexity in spatial arrangement, suggesting coordination over time. Tool distribution patterns imply shared access and possibly shared storage. In some cases, artifacts appear in contexts that suggest deliberate placement rather than simple discard, hinting at emerging conventions of meaning. Even hunting evidence reflects this shift. Coordinated drives of prey require individuals to maintain awareness not just of animals, but of each other's positions. Success depends on anticipating group movement as much as animal behavior. This creates a feedback loop where social awareness becomes inseparable from survival competence. Yet communication remains fragile. Misunderstanding carries immediate consequences. A mistimed movement can scatter prey. A misread gesture can lead to exposure or danger. Because of this, signals that persist are those that prove reliable across repeated use. Over generations, this selection pressure shapes the early foundations of shared meaning. What is forming here is not yet language as we know it, but its structural prerequisite a shared system of reference built on mutual adaptation. Meaning begins to exist outside any single mind. It is distributed across the group, reinforced through repetition, and refined through necessity. And within this distributed system, early humans begin to experience something new, the ability to coordinate intention across multiple individuals without direct physical intervention. Thought, in a limited and emerging form, begins to extend beyond the body. It is still fragile, still situational, still dependent on presence and context. But it is no longer isolated. The world is no longer navigated alone. It is navigated together, through signals that are only beginning to become shared meaning. Alongside survival and early communication, there exists another current in the lives of prehistoric humans, one less visible, less tangible, but no less significant. It flows in the spaces between action and rest, in the moments when the body is still, but the mind remains active. Dreams, intuition, and anticipation begin to occupy a subtle cognitive territory, suggesting that early humans are experimenting not only with the external world, but with their own inner landscapes. Evidence for this is fragmentary, but suggestive. Anthropologists note patterns in burial sites, artifact placement, and seasonal movement that imply a degree of foresight beyond immediate necessity. Certain locations are returned to not solely for practical reasons, but in patterns that hint at memory shaped by perception. by intuition, or by imagined consequences. It is as if the mind is projecting possibilities across time and space, attempting to anticipate events before they arrive. Dreams, though invisible to the archaeological record, likely served as rehearsals for reality. In the absence of recorded language, dreams and visions may have allowed early humans to simulate hunting scenarios, social encounters, or environmental hazards. The line between dream and plan could have been porous, each influencing the other. Intuition becomes a survival tool, honed over countless generations, calibrated to recognize subtle cues that are invisible in waking observation. Consider the tracking of prey across complex terrain. Success depends on noticing details, footprints barely visible in soft soil, broken branches indicating direction, subtle changes in wind carrying scent. Such information must be processed rapidly, sometimes without conscious deliberation. Here, intuition and anticipatory cognition function hand in hand. The hunter's mind does not compute each variable in isolation. It collapses them into a sense of what is likely, what is imminent, and what to do next. Survival is as much predictive as reactive. Intuition also shapes social behavior. In small groups where cooperation is essential, individuals begin to anticipate the needs, actions, and reactions of others. A nonverbal signal is interpreted before it is fully executed. A glance toward danger prompts coordinated movement even before an explicit warning is made. These anticipatory behaviors suggest an understanding of intention in others, a cognitive skill critical for both survival and emerging social complexity. Ritual in its most nascent forms may arise from this interior exploration. Simple arrangements of stones or pigment in caves could serve multiple purposes: markers of territory, preparation for ritualized activity, or rehearsal of abstract concepts. Repetition of such acts, often in locations removed from immediate subsistence needs, hints at mental activity that engages with symbolism, memory, and projection simultaneously. What survives in the record suggests that early humans were beginning to engage with ideas that could not be directly acted upon, but required internal reflection. Even fire, maintained over days and weeks, contributes to this mental space. Prolonged attention around a flame encourages contemplation, pattern recognition, and shared reflection. The dance of light and shadow on surrounding surfaces could have inspired early imaginative thought, allowing humans to perceive movement, narrative, and metaphor before words existed to encode them. Such experiences may have informed planning, social negotiation, or symbolic expression, long before formalized culture emerged. This is a critical phase because it reflects cognition reaching beyond the tangible. Memory is no longer simply a storehouse of survival strategies. It becomes a substrate for imagination. The mind starts to simulate conditions not present, to test actions internally, and to experiment with outcomes before committing physically. It is the threshold where reflection, anticipation, and abstract thinking converge. Intuition, in particular, emerges as a subtle but essential tool. Early humans operate in uncertainty not as passive observers, but as active interpreters of signals. A sound, a shadow, a shift in wind, or the behavior of animals becomes data. The mind integrates these cues with prior experience, producing immediate judgments that guide action. These judgments are often nonverbal, unarticulated, yet remarkably sophisticated in effect. Across landscapes, such capacities would have been unevenly distributed. Some individuals display heightened awareness of patterns, better memory for terrain, superior predictive instincts, or more nuanced social perception. These differences are invisible in the physical record, yet they shape group outcomes. A single perceptive individual can guide migration, improve hunting success, or maintain group cohesion in ways that profoundly affect survival odds. And so, the first humans are beginning to occupy dual worlds simultaneously: the external, dictated by the environment, and the internal, guided by memory, anticipation, and imagination. The two are intertwined. Action informs reflection. Reflection guides action. Success emerges not merely from brute strength or endurance, but from the capacity to project thought beyond the immediate, to consider what has not yet occurred, and to prepare for consequences unseen. In this space, the foundations of ritual, planning, and symbolic cognition quietly form. The human mind extends itself into possibilities, exploring outcomes without necessity. Early humans are no longer merely reacting to circumstance. They are beginning to engage with it preemptively, testing it, imagining it, negotiating it internally before committing to the world outside. It is a subtle, invisible revolution, laying the groundwork for the complex cognitive capacities that will eventually support language, culture, and abstract thought. What survives in the record is incomplete, yet tantalizing. The faint traces of these capacities suggest that prehistory is not merely a story of survival, but a story of minds expanding into their own possibilities, of humans beginning to inhabit the internal landscapes as carefully as the external. In these moments, long before words, thought begins to reach toward itself. As these internal explorations unfold, they begin to manifest in gestures that suggest ritualized awareness. Burials, once mere disposal of the dead, take on forms that hint at early conceptions of the self and community. Bodies are sometimes positioned deliberately, accompanied by ochre, tools, or ornaments. The reasons remain elusive. Scholars still debate whether these practices reflect respect, fear, symbolism, or preparation for an imagined afterlife, but the evidence indicates that even without language, humans were beginning to impose order on the profound uncertainty of death. Cave art, another striking facet of early ritual, offers a glimpse into the emergence of shared symbolic life. Marks and pigments are not merely decorative. Their placement, layering, and repeated forms suggest intentionality. Animals dominate the imagery, but often in abstracted or exaggerated ways that cannot be explained solely by observation of prey. These depictions may reflect early cognitive mapping, ritual practice, or the beginnings of narrative imagination. What survives is partial, yet it speaks to the capacity to represent, to encode meaning, and to communicate ideas beyond immediate survival. Objects accompanying ritual behaviors also hint at early belief systems. Stones arranged in circles or lines, pigments carefully prepared and stored, and small figurines all suggest attention to the intangible. These items, often curated and transported, imply thought directed toward concepts not physically present: memory, identity, or community norms. No single explanation fully accounts for their existence, but collectively, they point to humans grappling with forces beyond the visible and the immediate. Ritual, in this sense, becomes both social and cognitive. It consolidates group cohesion, structures repeated activity, and reinforces emerging concepts of shared space and shared attention. Around fire, in caves, or at burial sites. These behaviors embed knowledge into practice. Individuals learn not only through imitation, but through participation in acts that are meaningful, yet not strictly utilitarian. Understanding emerges through engagement as much as observation. Even everyday acts begin to acquire ritualized qualities, repetition of tool-making, patterns in the use of pigments, and consistent placement of objects may serve multiple functions, functional, mnemonic, and symbolic simultaneously. This blending of practicality and meaning reflects a human capacity to encode abstract thought into material action, laying the groundwork for complex culture. The cognitive implications are profound. These practices suggest awareness of time beyond the immediate moment, intentionality beyond basic survival, and recognition of mortality and community. Early humans are experimenting with ways to structure experience, to impose narrative, and to externalize thought through objects and actions. They are, in essence, beginning to construct a symbolic world. Socially, ritual reinforces observation and shared understanding. A repeated act at a burial site or cave wall is not merely personal. It communicates to others the importance of certain behaviors, materials, or locations. Even without formal language, conventions begin to emerge, transmitted across individuals and, in some cases, across generations. These practices strengthen memory and cultural continuity, ensuring that knowledge is encoded into behavior, not solely into ephemeral memory. At the same time, ritual is adaptive. Engaging with symbolic action may improve group cohesion, reduce conflict, and establish roles within communities. It may also serve as rehearsal for practical skills, reinforcing patterns of attention, coordination, and anticipation in contexts that extend beyond immediate survival. Fire management, tool preparation, and spatial organization become intertwined with these proto-ritual behaviors, creating a layered cognitive landscape. Evidence from multiple continents demonstrates the universality of these tendencies. Burials, pigments, and incised objects appear in Africa, Europe, and Asia, often separated by thousands of kilometers and centuries of time. While materials and styles differ, the underlying cognitive thrust is consistent. Humans are beginning to manipulate their environment not only to meet biological needs, but to express, to reflect, and to preserve ideas. This stage also suggests early attempts to grapple with causality and agency. Arranging stones, depositing pigments, or carefully positioning the deceased may imply belief in influence beyond the self, even if only nascent or symbolic. Humans are beginning to consider effects that extend beyond immediate perception effects on others, on memory, on the invisible forces that govern life and death. Importantly, these behaviors are neither uniform nor inevitable. Many groups leave no evidence of ritual, while others demonstrate elaborate sequences of action. Variation likely reflects environmental, demographic, and cultural factors, as well as the uneven preservation of material traces. No single site captures the entirety of prehistory, yet collectively, the evidence points to a developing cognitive and social sophistication emerging in parallel with survival and communication. Through ritual, humans begin to extend cognition into shared spaces, into objects, and into time. They are learning to encode thought, emotion, and expectation outside the body, creating a persistent layer of meaning that others can access. This is the foundation of symbolic life, the prelude to structured culture, storytelling, and eventually, language. By engaging with the unknown death, danger, and the unseen, early humans transform uncertainty into repeated, observable practice. experimenting with abstraction while negotiating the demands of survival. In these quiet, deliberate acts, the first glimpses of human imagination appear. The world is no longer only endured or navigated, it is being contemplated, interpreted, and, in the simplest terms, remembered collectively. It is a world imbued with meaning that extends beyond the immediate, a world where survival and reflection begin to intersect. In the deep stretches of prehistory, human groups do not exist in isolation. They move through overlapping territories shared, contested, or simply crossed without recognition of boundaries as they will later be understood. Within this slow, drifting geography, encounters occur, some brief, some sustained, and a few that quietly reshape the trajectory of human cognition itself. Among the most significant of these encounters are those with other hominin groups, Neanderthals in Eurasia, Denisovans in parts of Asia, and possibly other now vanished populations represent not parallel worlds, but intersecting branches of a shared evolutionary landscape. These groups are not abstractions. They are physical presences, competitors, neighbors, and in some cases, genetic partners, each adapted to different environments, each carrying distinct behavioral traditions. Archaeological evidence suggests that when modern humans expand into these regions, interaction is not always immediate conflict. There are zones of overlap where tools, resources, and even genetic material are exchanged. Some of the clearest signs of this interaction come not from artifacts alone, but from the human genome itself, where traces of interbreeding remain embedded in populations today. This biological inheritance is silent, but it carries the memory of ancient proximity. Yet beyond genetics, the more subtle question is cognitive exchange. When different hominin groups encounter one another, they are not merely observing different bodies, they are encountering different ways of being intelligent in the world. Tool styles vary, hunting strategies differ, shelter construction reflects distinct environmental logic. Even patterns of movement across landscape show divergence shaped by long adaptation histories. For early humans, such differences may have functioned as both challenge and stimulus. Observing alternative strategies forces comparison. Comparison, in turn, is one of the roots of abstraction. It requires the mind to hold multiple models of behavior simultaneously and evaluate their relative effectiveness. In this way, intergroup encounters may have acted as accelerants for cognitive flexibility. Some archaeological sites hint at cultural blending. Tool traditions appear in hybrid forms, combining elements associated with different populations. Techniques of flint knapping or bone shaping show variation that cannot be easily attributed to environmental constraints alone. While interpretation remains cautious, scholars still debate the extent to which these patterns reflect direct interaction versus independent convergence. No single explanation fully accounts for the variability. What is clearer is that survival in shared landscapes often demanded awareness of others beyond one's own group. Competition for resources such as hunting grounds, water access, and shelter sites would have created pressure not only for physical adaptation, but for social and cognitive awareness of external agents with similar capabilities. This introduces a new dimension to prehistoric life, the need to model not just animals and environments, but other minds. This cognitive expansion is subtle but profound. Understanding that another group can anticipate, strategize, and adapt forces early humans to refine their own predictive abilities. It is no longer sufficient to read animal behavior or environmental cues. One must also consider the intentions of competitors who are themselves observers and planners. This recursive awareness thinking about what others might think marks a significant step toward complex social cognition. Even without language, this kind of modeling shapes behavior. Avoidance patterns, territorial adjustments, and opportunistic timing of resource use all reflect an implicit understanding of others' presence. Groups may shift movement routes not only based on environmental conditions but also based on inferred activity of neighboring populations. Such decisions are not recorded explicitly in the archaeological record, but their effects are visible in settlement distribution and resource usage patterns. In rare cases, direct evidence of contact appears in shared symbolic or technological traits. However, caution is necessary. Similar tools do not always indicate interaction. They may arise independently under similar pressures. Still, the possibility of exchange remains significant, particularly in regions where multiple hominin groups overlapped for extended periods. The Denisovans, for example, remain largely invisible in material culture except through genetic traces and fragmentary remains. Yet their existence complicates any simple narrative of human development. They were not background actors, but participants in a complex web of adaptation and interaction. Their legacy, embedded in modern human populations in Asia and Oceania, suggests that encounters between groups were not rare anomalies, but recurring features of prehistoric life. In this context, cognition is not evolving in isolation. It is shaped by a broader ecosystem of intelligent beings, each influencing the others through competition, observation, and occasional exchange. This environment of multiple intelligences may have intensified the pressure toward behavioral flexibility, innovation, and social awareness. At the same time, these encounters highlight a deeper uncertainty. The archaeological record preserves fragments of interaction but not the subjective experience of those moments. We cannot know how early humans perceived other hominin groups, whether as kin, rivals, or something entirely outside their conceptual framework. What remains are the traces of consequence, not intention. Still, within those traces, a pattern emerges. Human cognition is not only responding to nature, but to other forms of cognition. This recursive dynamic mind encountering mind introduces a layer of complexity that reshapes survival, strategy, and social organization. In the shadow of these encounters, early humans begin to inhabit a world that is not only physically challenging but cognitively populated. The environment includes not just animals and landscapes, but other observers, other planners, other interpreters of reality. And in recognizing this, however faintly, the human mind expands once again, pushed not only by nature, but by the presence of other minds moving through the same ancient world. The landscape that early humans inhabit is never still. It shifts beneath their feet across timescales too vast to perceive directly, yet constantly shaping the conditions of survival. Rivers change course, forests advance and retreat, ice spreads across continents, then withdraws again, leaving behind altered ecosystems that demand rapid adaptation. In this unstable world, survival is not only a matter of skill, but of timing in relation to forces far larger than any single group can comprehend. Climate is one of the most powerful of these forces. During glacial periods, colder and drier conditions reshape habitats across vast regions. Vegetation contracts, megafauna migrate or disappear, and water sources become more unpredictable. In warmer interglacial phases, landscapes expand with new ecological opportunities, but also new risks as species move into previously unoccupied territories. Early humans must navigate both extremes without any conceptual framework for long-term environmental cycles. Yet despite this lack of formal understanding, behavioral patterns suggest an implicit sensitivity to change. Archaeological distributions show shifts in settlement locations over time that correspond with environmental transitions. Groups follow resource availability with remarkable adaptability, moving across wide territories as conditions fluctuate. This is not conscious prediction in the modern sense, but an accumulated responsiveness to repeated experience across generations. Some of the most dramatic challenges come from megafaunal dynamics. Large herbivores and predators dominate ecosystems, and their movements shape human survival strategies. When populations of these animals decline or shift due to climate pressure, human groups are forced to adjust hunting practices, dietary strategies, and mobility patterns. In some regions, the disappearance of key species correlates with changes in tool use and settlement density. Though causality is complex and still debated among scholars, extinction events during the Pleistocene period further intensify these pressures. In several parts of the world, large animal populations declined significantly over relatively short geological periods. The reasons remain contested: climate change, human hunting, ecological competition, or combinations of these factors likely all play roles. No single explanation fully accounts for the pattern, but the consequences are clear. Food systems are destabilized, and human groups must diversify survival strategies. This diversification is evident in archaeological records showing broader diets, increased reliance on smaller game, plant processing, and more flexible foraging strategies. Tools evolve accordingly. Stone technologies become more varied, specialized, and regionally adapted. Scrapers, blades, and composite tools indicate not just improved craftsmanship, but a response to environmental uncertainty that demands versatility rather than specialization. Fire management also becomes increasingly critical under these conditions. Controlled use of fire allows early humans to modify landscapes, encourage certain plant growth, drive game, and maintain warmth in colder climates. Evidence of repeated burning in specific regions suggests that fire is no longer only a naturally occurring resource, but a managed element of survival strategy. This control, however rudimentary, represents a profound shift in human-environment interaction. Environmental instability also reshapes social organization. When resources are abundant and predictable, groups may remain relatively stable in size and composition. Under conditions of scarcity or rapid change, flexibility becomes essential. Groups may split and merge more frequently, following shifting resource patterns. This dynamic structure allows for rapid adaptation, but also requires strong mechanisms for cooperation and information sharing. Migration routes extend across vast distances over generations. What begins as seasonal movement can evolve into long-term dispersal, as populations follow changing ecosystems into new territories. These movements are not linear. They are iterative, often revisiting previous regions under new conditions. In this way, human presence becomes layered across landscapes, leaving overlapping traces of occupation that archaeologists must carefully interpret. Within this context, cognitive adaptation becomes as important as physical adaptation. Recognizing environmental cues, changes in animal behavior, plant cycles, water availability becomes a critical survival skill. Memory across generations preserves knowledge of past conditions, while observation allows continuous updating of strategies. Even without formal environmental science, early humans develop an intuitive understanding of ecological relationships. There is also evidence that environmental stress may have influenced technological innovation. Periods of instability often correlate with increased variability in tool industries, suggesting that pressure drives experimentation. When traditional strategies fail, new approaches emerge. This pattern reflects a broader principle. Uncertainty does not simply challenge survival, it accelerates cognitive and technological flexibility. Despite these adaptations, many groups do not persist through major environmental transitions. The archaeological record is marked by absences regions once occupied that later show no continuity of habitation. These gaps are reminders that survival is never guaranteed. Even with adaptation, entire populations can disappear without leaving clear narrative traces, their existence inferred only through material remnants. Still, across these cycles of expansion and contraction, a deeper pattern emerges. Human cognition is increasingly shaped by long-term environmental rhythms, even if those rhythms are not consciously understood. The ability to respond to change, to anticipate based on past experience, and to adjust behavior across generations becomes central to survival. In this way, the environment is not only a backdrop to human development, it is an active force shaping cognition itself. Pressure from climate, fauna, and geography filters behaviors, reinforcing those that allow flexibility and eliminating those that do not. Over immense spans of time, this process refines not just tools and strategies, but the very structure of human thought. Early humans do not yet understand the world as a system, but they are already living inside one that is constantly selecting, shaping, and reshaping the boundaries of possibility. And within that shifting world, only adaptability remains constant. At a certain threshold in prehistory, survival alone is no longer enough to explain the direction of human cognition. Tools improve, social systems stabilize, and environmental awareness deepens. Yet something more fundamental begins to emerge beneath these developments. It is the slow formation of structured communication, not yet language in its fully realized form, but something that begins to resemble it in function, if not in complexity. The seeds of language are not planted in a single moment. They grow from countless layers of interaction, repetition, and shared context. Early humans already communicate through gesture, posture, and sound. But these signals remain flexible, heavily dependent on immediate situation. What begins to change is the increasing consistency of meaning. Certain gestures begin to stabilize in function across repeated use. Certain sounds begin to carry predictable associations. Meaning, once fluid and situational, starts to gain structure. This shift is subtle but transformative. A gesture that once meant only attention here in a specific moment begins to carry broader implications depending on context. A sound associated with danger in one setting begins to be used in others with similar outcomes. Through repetition, groups begin to converge on shared interpretations, reducing ambiguity in critical situations such as hunting, migration, or conflict. Proto-language, in this sense, is not a system of grammar but a network of shared expectations. It relies on memory, imitation, and reinforcement rather than formal rules. Its power lies in its efficiency. Information can be transmitted faster than observation alone would allow. This efficiency becomes increasingly important as group size and environmental complexity grow. Archaeological evidence cannot capture spoken communication, but indirect signs suggest increasing coordination complexity. Hunting strategies require synchronized timing across multiple individuals. Large animals are driven toward natural traps or constrained spaces through coordinated movement. Such actions imply rapid, non-physical communication occurring in real time. Whether through sound, gesture, or combined signals, information must be transmitted quickly and reliably. Sound likely plays a central role in this transition. Vocalizations, originally tied to emotion or instinct, begin to acquire differentiated functions. Some sounds may signal alarm, others coordination, others group assembly. The human vocal apparatus, already more flexible than that of most animals, provides a rich medium for experimentation. Over time, certain vocal patterns become preferred because they reduce misunderstanding. Importantly, these early communicative systems are not uniform across populations. Different groups develop distinct sets of signals, shaped by environment, culture, and social structure. This diversity suggests that language is not inherited as a fixed system, but constructed locally, emerging independently in multiple regions as cognitive and social pressures align. One of the most significant developments in this phase is the increasing ability to refer to things that are not immediately present. Early communication is typically anchored in the here and now danger, food, direction, or immediate social coordination. But gradually, signals begin to refer to absent objects, past events, or anticipated actions. This displacement is a critical cognitive leap. It allows information to extend beyond immediate perception. For example, a group may signal not only the presence of prey, but the location where prey was previously seen. Or they may refer to a location not currently visible, guiding movement based on memory rather than direct observation. This ability to reference absence is one of the foundational features of language-like thought. As these systems evolve, they begin to support more complex social structures. Coordination becomes faster and more precise. Conflicts can be mediated through shared signals rather than purely physical confrontation. Cooperative planning becomes more reliable. The group, as a cognitive unit, becomes more cohesive, capable of acting with a level of synchronization that would be impossible through observation alone. Yet even at this stage, communication remains fragile. Misinterpretation is common. Signals can be ambiguous, overlapping, or context-dependent. Meaning is still heavily reliant on shared experience. Without it, communication fails. This dependency limits the expansion of communication but also anchors it deeply in lived reality. Tool-making traditions reflect this growing communicative capacity. Certain techniques appear to spread across wide regions, suggesting transmission of knowledge between groups or through migrating populations. The consistency of these techniques implies that information about production methods is being preserved and shared more effectively than before. Still, caution is necessary in interpretation. Not all similarities indicate communication. Some arise independently under similar environmental pressures. But the increasing complexity and regional variation of technologies suggest that human groups are not developing in isolation. Ideas, whether encoded in gesture, demonstration, or early vocal systems, are beginning to move across populations. The emergence of proto-language also transforms thought itself. Once external signals can represent absent or abstract concepts, internal cognition begins to mirror this structure. Thinking becomes less tied to immediate sensory input and more capable of recombination, combining past experiences, imagined scenarios, and observed patterns into flexible mental models. This internal shift may be one of the most profound developments in human history. It marks the beginning of thought that is not strictly reactive, but generative. The mind begins to construct possibilities rather than simply respond to realities, and from this point onward, every improvement in survival, cooperation, and adaptation is increasingly shaped not only by what humans experience, but by what they can begin to represent to one another. The foundations of language are not yet visible in full form, but their structure is already taking shape in gesture, sound, memory, and shared intention. The world is slowly becoming speakable. Before language stabilizes into structured form, before stories can be passed in recognizable sequences of sound, human knowledge exists in a more fragile but remarkably resilient system, memory carried in bodies, repeated in action, and reinforced through shared experience. In this world, there are no written records, no fixed archives, and no permanent external storage of information. Yet knowledge persists across generations with surprising effectiveness. This is memory without writing. It is not stored in any single place. It is distributed across individuals, environments, and repeated practices. A successful hunting strategy is not preserved in abstraction, but reenacted until it becomes habit. A safe migration route is not recorded, but walked again and again until the landscape itself becomes a mnemonic structure. The world is remembered through movement. In this system, repetition is the primary mechanism of survival. Actions that prove successful are repeated not only by individuals but by groups, gradually stabilizing into tradition. These traditions are not symbolic in the modern sense, but they function as reliable carriers of information. They encode knowledge in rhythm, sequence, and shared behavior. Even simple routines, how to prepare food, how to organize a campsite, how to approach fire, become forms of memory externalized into action. Over time, these routines acquire a durability that outlasts individual lifespans. New members of a group do not need explicit instruction. They learn through observation and participation. Knowledge is absorbed through immersion rather than explanation. This mode of transmission is powerful, but also vulnerable. It depends entirely on continuity. If a group is disrupted, if a generation is lost, or if environmental conditions force radical change, knowledge can fragment or disappear entirely. What survives is only what is repeatedly reinforced. Yet within this fragile system, early forms of storytelling begin to emerge, not stories in the structured narrative sense, but sequences of remembered events that are retold through gesture, sound, and reenactment. A successful hunt might be repeated not only in action but in symbolic replay movements, mimicking pursuit, capture, and return. These reenactments serve both practical and social functions. They reinforce memory, and they strengthen group cohesion. Over time, these reenactments become increasingly stylized. Certain gestures are exaggerated, certain sounds are consistently paired with specific actions. The boundary between memory and performance begins to blur. What was once a direct recollection becomes a shared representation of experience. This transformation is subtle but significant. It marks the beginning of narrative structure and arrangement of events that can be recalled, reshaped, and transmitted independently of immediate context. Even without formal language, humans begin to organize experience into sequences with recognizable beginnings, developments, and outcomes. In parallel, landscapes themselves become mnemonic frameworks. Certain locations are associated with specific events, a successful hunt, a dangerous encounter, a seasonal migration. These places carry meaning not because of inherent properties, but because of accumulated experience. The environment becomes a distributed memory system, where geography encodes history. Archaeological evidence supports this indirect relationship between memory and landscape. Repeated occupation sites show long-term continuity of use, often across vast stretches of time. certain regions appear to function as recurring nodes in human movement patterns. While we cannot reconstruct the exact meanings attached to these places, their persistent use suggests significance beyond immediate utility. In some cases, artifacts appear arranged in ways that imply remembrance rather than pure function. Objects are left in specific locations, not discarded randomly. These placements may reflect recognition of place-based memory, an early attempt to anchor experience in physical space, whether symbolic, practical, or both. Such behavior indicates that memory is becoming externalized beyond the individual mind. As groups grow and movement becomes more complex, memory begins to require coordination. Different individuals hold different fragments of knowledge. One may remember seasonal changes in vegetation. Another may recall safe passage through difficult terrain. Another may retain details of tool production. Together, these distributed memories form a collective cognitive system. This system is not centralized. It depends on overlap, repetition, and redundancy. Information is reinforced through shared action rather than formal instruction. The loss of any single individual is significant, but not catastrophic, as long as enough overlap exists within the group. Still, the system remains vulnerable to disruption. Environmental change, migration, or population loss can erase entire layers of accumulated knowledge. Archaeology reveals these gaps indirectly, through abrupt shifts in tool traditions or settlement patterns. These discontinuities remind us that prehistoric knowledge was not guaranteed to persist. Despite this fragility, the system proves remarkably adaptive. It allows humans to survive in diverse environments without formal recording systems. Knowledge is embedded in practice, and practice is embedded in daily life. Survival and memory are inseparable. Within this framework, the earlier seeds of storytelling begin to grow into something more structured, not yet written, not yet fixed, but increasingly coherent. Events are not only remembered, they are arranged, repeated, and shared in ways that begin to resemble narrative logic. And so, long before words are fully formed, before grammar and syntax emerge, humans are already living within stories, stories encoded in movement, place, and repetition, carried forward not on pages, but in the living continuity of action itself. Innovation emerges as the lifeblood of survival. Beyond memory, beyond shared routines, early humans begin to experiment, to recombine knowledge, and to extend cognitive reach through invention. Tools evolve not only in refinement, but in complexity, reflecting thought that anticipates multiple outcomes and adapts to diverse tasks. Stone blades become more specialized. Bone implements take forms optimized for piercing, scraping, or carving. These innovations are not random, they are responses to practical challenges, environmental pressures, and the growing demands of social coordination. In some regions, composite tools appear, combining multiple materials into single functional units. A wooden shaft tipped with a stone point, bound together with sinew, embodies foresight, planning, and an understanding of material properties. Creating such tools requires sequences of action that must be remembered, practiced, and transmitted. It is a cognitive feat that blends motor skill with abstract anticipation, yet it is inseparable from survival. One misaligned strike, one brittle binding, and the tool fails when it's needed most. Innovation also extends to art and symbolic activity. Pigments are mixed, patterns repeated, and decorative motifs appear on personal objects. While the practical purpose of such embellishments is unclear, they demonstrate intentionality beyond immediate utility. The mind is experimenting with abstraction, representation, and perhaps aesthetic sense. These experiments are tentative, often incomplete, but their persistence across generations suggests that innovation is valued, remembered, and transmitted within the group. Even daily survival routines become sites of experimentation. New methods of food preparation, new arrangements of living spaces, or novel ways to exploit natural materials emerge incrementally. Some are successful and propagate, others fail and disappear. What survives reflects a subtle process of trial and selection, one in which cognition and material culture evolve in tandem. In this sense, the early human mind is both experimental and adaptive, constantly recalibrating based on environmental feedback. Innovation is rarely solitary, it is socially embedded. Observing another individual manipulate a tool, arrange pigments, or organize a workspace transmits not only technique, but the conceptual framework underlying the action. Imitation is selective. The observer chooses what appears effective, feasible, or adaptable. Through this process, innovations are amplified across the group, creating collective advances without formal teaching. Knowledge becomes cumulative, slowly building over generations. Environmental pressures intensify this process. Changing climates, resource scarcity, and the challenges of megafauna survival demand flexibility. Groups that can experiment and adapt survive, those that cannot vanish. In some cases, these pressures lead to rapid technological shifts, producing clusters of innovation in relatively short spans of time. The archaeological record shows punctuated patterns of change in tool industries, suggesting periods when necessity catalyzes creativity. At the same time, innovation is bound by cognition. Not all ideas are feasible, not all strategies can be imagined. The earliest humans operate within constraints imposed by perception, motor skill, and shared memory. Yet even within these limits, the range of possibility is vast. Small improvements like sharpening a blade angle or adjusting binding materials can yield disproportionately large advantages in hunting efficiency or processing resources. Innovation also fosters social differentiation. Some individuals become recognized as particularly skilled, perceptive, or inventive. Their contributions influence group strategies and increase survival odds for all. This informal recognition may reinforce experimentation, creating a positive feedback loop in which creative problem-solving is encouraged within social networks. In some sites, we see early evidence of symbolic innovation tied to social identity. Ornaments, pigment markings, and carefully curated objects suggest experimentation not solely for practical reasons, but as a form of expression. These innovations may signal status, group affiliation, or mastery of specific techniques. Even when their purpose is opaque, they reveal minds pushing beyond necessity into conceptual territory. Crucially, innovation interacts with memory and communication. A new tool or practice is only advantageous if it can be remembered and shared. This integration binds cognition to culture invention without transmission is ephemeral. Memory without adaptation is stagnant. Together, these elements create a scaffold for cumulative knowledge, setting the stage for more complex thought, coordination, and eventually, formalized language. Through innovation, early humans are not simply reacting to the world, they are reshaping it, anticipating new possibilities, and constructing solutions that extend cognitive reach. Each improvement, each experimental act, embeds thought into material form, creating a visible record of invisible processes. And in this iterative interplay of observation, experimentation, and adaptation, the human mind begins to approach its first glimpses of abstract reasoning, capable of manipulating both material and conceptual landscapes in ways that will define the trajectory of culture for millennia to come. Across the scattered record of prehistory, there are moments where the archaeological trace refuses to fit neatly into expectation. Objects appear in contexts that suggest intention beyond simple utility, or they exhibit levels of complexity that challenge easy categorization within known technological stages. These are the quiet anomalies fragments that hint at cognitive depth we cannot fully reconstruct. Such mysteries do not overturn the broader understanding of human development, but they complicate it. A carved object found far from its raw material source, shaped with unusual precision, raises questions about motivation and transmission. A site with repeated geometric arrangements of stones, lacking clear functional purpose, suggests that spatial organization may have carried meaning beyond survival efficiency. In each case, interpretation remains cautious, because context is often incomplete and preservation uneven. Some artifacts show patterns of abstraction that seem ahead of their time. Incised lines on bone or stone occasionally form regular sequences that resist purely practical explanation, while some may be the result of functional marking counts of resources, tracking of time, or tool maintenance. Others appear to extend beyond immediate necessity. Scholars still debate whether these represent early symbolic systems, mnemonic devices, or simply coincidental patterns shaped by repeated action. No single explanation fully accounts for the diversity of these findings. Equally intriguing are sites where pigments and materials are concentrated in ways that suggest deliberate accumulation rather than incidental use. Ochre deposit, for instance, appear in contexts where they are not strictly required for tool production or subsistence activity. Their presence implies that color, texture, or visual effect may have held significance beyond utility. Whether this significance was social, cognitive, or ritual remains uncertain, but it points toward an expanding sensitivity to material properties as carriers of meaning. In some cases, spatial organization itself becomes difficult to interpret. Certain areas show repeated return and structured placement of objects over long periods. Hearths are rebuilt in consistent locations. Boundaries between activity zones remain stable across generations. While these patterns may reflect practical efficiency, they may also indicate early conventions, shared understandings of space that transcend individual decision-making. These conventions, once established, could persist long after their original purpose faded from memory. One of the most persistent challenges in interpreting these anomalies is distinguishing between intention and pattern. The human mind is naturally inclined to recognize structure, even in randomness. Archaeology must therefore proceed carefully, avoiding the projection of meaning where none exists. Yet at the same time, it must also remain open to the possibility that early humans were experimenting with forms of cognition and expression that do not map cleanly onto modern categories. There are also cases where artifacts appear to show a level of craftsmanship that suggest practice skill beyond immediate survival necessity. Tools refined beyond functional requirement may indicate not only technical ability, but an interest in mastery itself. This introduces the possibility that skill development was becoming an end in its own right, reinforcing cognitive engagement with materials and processes. Environmental context often deepens the mystery. In regions where conditions were harsh or unstable, the presence of seemingly non-essential artifacts becomes more striking. Why invest energy in shaping or transporting objects that do not directly improve survival? One interpretation is that such actions serve social or cognitive functions we can no longer fully perceive, reinforcing group identity, marking time, or structuring shared experience in ways that left no explicit record. It is also possible that some of these artifacts represent transitional stages of cognition experiments in representation that did not fully develop into stable systems. Early symbolic behavior may not have followed a linear trajectory. Instead, it may have emerged in bursts, varied across regions, and sometimes disappeared without leaving descendants in later cultural forms. What is consistent across these findings is not certainty, but potential. Each anomaly suggests that the cognitive landscape of prehistory was more varied and exploratory than a simple progression from primitive to advanced might imply. Instead of a single path, there may have been multiple overlapping experiments in how humans understood, represented, and interacted with their world. This perspective shifts interpretation away from rigid frameworks and toward a more dynamic understanding of cognitive evolution. Early humans were not merely refining survival strategies, they were also probing the boundaries of perception, material manipulation, and symbolic possibility. Some of these experiments endured and expanded, others vanished without continuation. The archaeological record preserves only fragments of this broader cognitive experimentation. What is missing may be as significant as what remains. Entire ways of thinking could have existed briefly, leaving only faint traces in object placement, material selection, or spatial arrangement before disappearing under the pressures of environmental change or cultural transformation. And so, these mysteries do not stand as contradictions to what is known, but as reminders of how incomplete the record truly is. They suggest a prehistoric world in which cognition was not uniform, but exploratory, not fixed, but adaptive, not fully visible, but constantly in motion. Within these fragments, we glimpse the edges of minds experimenting with meaning itself, long before meaning would be stabilized into language, tradition, or history. Over vast stretches of time, the scattered experiments of early humans begin to converge. What once appeared as isolated innovations, local traditions, or fragile gestures of meaning gradually form broader patterns. Survival strategies stabilize. Communication becomes more reliable. Symbolic behaviors, though still uneven across regions, persist long enough to influence the development of later cultures. In this slow convergence, the foundations of long-term human cultural continuity begin to emerge. Cultural legacy in prehistory is not transmitted through formal systems, but through accumulation. Each generation inherits not only tools and techniques, but also ways of seeing the world shaped by repeated action. A hunting strategy refined over centuries becomes embedded in instinctive group behavior. A method of shelter construction becomes so familiar that its origins are no longer consciously remembered. Knowledge fades into habit, and habit becomes identity. This process creates a continuity that is both resilient and fragile. Resilient, because it does not depend on written records or centralized instruction. Fragile, because it can be disrupted by environmental change, population loss, or migration. When continuity breaks, it does not always leave obvious traces. Entire ways of life can disappear, leaving only subtle shifts in artifact styles or settlement patterns to suggest that something once stable has been lost. Yet even within disruption, traces of earlier cognition persist. Certain spatial habits recur across regions separated by time and distance. The placement of hearths, the organization of activity zones, and the repeated use of symbolic motifs suggest that underlying cognitive structures endure even as specific cultural expressions change. These structures may reflect shared features of human perception and memory, ways in which the mind naturally organizes space, time, and experience. As populations expand into new environments, these cognitive frameworks are tested and reshaped. Migration introduces humans to unfamiliar landscapes, deserts, forests, coastlines, high-altitude regions. Each environment demands adaptation, but also offers opportunities for innovation. In this process, older practices are modified rather than discarded, creating layered traditions that carry echoes of earlier lifeways while responding to new conditions. In some regions, these adaptations become especially pronounced. Changes in climate or resource distribution force rapid reorganization of subsistence strategies. Tools diversify, settlement patterns shift, and social structures adjust to new pressures. Yet beneath these visible changes, continuity remains in the cognitive processes that guide decision-making, observation, memory, imitation, and experimentation. One of the most important aspects of this long-term continuity is the gradual stabilization of symbolic thought. Even before fully developed language, humans demonstrate consistent tendencies to mark objects, spaces, and events in ways that extend beyond immediate function. These markings may serve multiple roles simultaneously: practical, mnemonic, and social, but over time they contribute to a shared framework of meaning that persists across generations. This emerging symbolic framework does not yet resemble formal systems of writing or structured mythology. Instead, it exists as a flexible network of associations. Certain places become meaningful through repeated use. Certain materials acquire significance through selection and handling. Certain actions gain weight through repetition in specific contexts. Together, these elements form a cultural memory that is distributed across landscapes and practices rather than concentrated in texts or institutions. The archaeological record captures only the physical remnants of this process, but those remnants suggest a gradual increase in complexity and abstraction. Over time, artifacts become more standardized within regions, indicating shared conventions. At the same time, regional variation increases, reflecting the adaptation of shared cognitive frameworks to different environments and social contexts. This balance between unity and diversity is a defining feature of late prehistory. Perhaps most importantly, these developments suggest that human cognition itself is being shaped by cultural inheritance. Thought is no longer solely a product of individual experience. It is increasingly influenced by inherited practices, learned behaviors, and shared patterns of interpretation. The mind becomes both biological and cultural, shaped by evolution and history simultaneously. This dual inheritance allows for cumulative development. Innovations are not lost with individual lifespans, but embedded in group practices. Each generation builds upon the adaptations of the previous one, even without conscious awareness of doing so. Over long periods, this accumulation produces significant changes in behavior, perception, and social organization. And yet, despite this progression, there is no final point of arrival. Prehistory does not move toward a single endpoint. It unfolds as a series of overlapping adaptations, each shaped by local conditions and historical contingencies. What we recognize as advancement is often simply one successful pathway among many that once existed. The legacy of these early humans is therefore not a linear story of improvement, but a complex web of survival, adaptation, and cognitive experimentation. Their influence persists not only in genetic inheritance, but in the deep structures of human thought, the ways we perceive space, organize memory, and construct meaning from experience. In this sense, prehistory is not a distant beginning that has been left behind. It is embedded within every layer of later human development, shaping cultures that would eventually grow into history itself. The patterns formed in these earliest times continue to echo, quietly but persistently, in the structure of human life. As the prehistoric arc approaches the threshold of recorded history, the slow accumulation of cognition, culture, and social complexity reaches a critical inflection point. Humans are no longer simply reacting to their environment, they are anticipating, representing, and organizing both the material and conceptual world. Tools are refined and specialized, symbolic marks persist across generations, and communication, though not yet fully verbal, is increasingly structured and reliable. Groups navigate landscapes not merely for survival, but with foresight, coordination, and memory embedded in practice. It is in this stage that the first steps toward abstraction, planning, and social structure coalesce. Hunting strategies are coordinated over multiple days. Resource storage is planned for future scarcity. Symbolic objects are curated and maintained. Spatial organization reflects intention beyond immediate needs, and repeated behaviors encode shared understanding within the group. These practices form the foundation of cultural continuity, providing the scaffolding upon which more complex forms of thought and communication will be built. Evidence from settlement patterns, tool assemblages, and symbolic artifacts shows that humans are beginning to internalize collective memory. Knowledge is no longer solely the possession of individuals, it is distributed across groups, reinforced through repetition and observation. The landscape itself becomes a repository of experience paths traced over generations, campsites repeatedly occupied, special locations revisited with meaning. These repeated actions ensure that cognitive innovations, whether technical, social, or symbolic, persist beyond individual lifespans. Interactions with other hominin species continue to shape cognition as well. Observing different strategies, encountering alternative forms of tool-making, and occasionally integrating genetic material all contribute to a rich, shared evolutionary and cultural environment. These exchanges, direct or indirect, broaden adaptive possibilities and expand the repertoire of strategies available to human groups. By this stage, memory, experimentation, and social coordination converge with environmental and technological pressures to produce cumulative cultural evolution. Each innovation builds on previous knowledge. Each repetition reinforces learned behaviors. And each encounter, whether with nature or another human group, creates new opportunities for adaptation. The stage is set for the eventual emergence of formalized language, storytelling, and historical consciousness. Yet prehistory is not merely a narrative of linear progress. It is a story of variability, contingency, and selective persistence. Many groups, strategies, and behaviors vanish, leaving gaps in the record that remind us of the fragility of human endeavor. What survives reflects success across countless trials, environmental challenges, and social negotiations. Within this dynamic landscape, the human mind has transformed. It has developed memory systems capable of encoding repeated experience, abstract reasoning sufficient to anticipate and plan, and social cognition that allows coordination and cooperation across time and space. Symbolic expression, though still rudimentary, introduces a capacity to encode meaning beyond immediate survival. early humans now inhabit a world shaped as much by thought as by environment. This is the threshold of history. Language, once fully stabilized, will allow these cognitive structures to be articulated, shared, and preserved in ways that prehistory cannot fully capture. Narrative, ritual, and record-keeping emerge from this foundation, carrying forward the accumulated experience of countless generations. The human mind, honed by survival, social necessity, and experimentation, stands ready to enter the world of recorded knowledge. At this juncture, prehistory and history are not sharply divided but exist as overlapping domains. The cognitive and cultural capacities developed over millennia form the undercurrent that supports every subsequent human achievement. Tools, symbols, rituals, and memory systems converge into a coherent substrate, upon which spoken language, oral traditions, and eventually writing can build. The echoes of these early minds persist, embedded in the rhythms of human thought, sociality, and material culture. What remains remarkable is the continuity across time. From the first hesitant grasp of a stone tool to the structured coordination of late prehistoric societies, human cognition evolves through repeated engagement with environment, group, and self. Each generation contributes to a cumulative process, laying the foundations for the complex societies, technologies, and symbolic worlds that will define human history. And so, at the edge of written memory, humans have already traversed an immense cognitive journey. They have invented strategies, tools, social structures, and symbolic behaviors that allow not only survival, but the projection of thought into the future. Prehistory is a story of minds expanding into their own possibilities, a gradual accumulation of insight, experimentation, and adaptation that prepares humanity for the next chapter, the world of words. In the slow aftermath of prehistory, there is no sudden break, no clean boundary where one world ends and another begins. Instead, there is a gradual tightening of structure around something that has been forming for tens of thousands of years. Sound becomes more precise, meaning becomes more stable, shared understanding becomes less dependent on immediate context and more dependent on agreed form. What once existed as gesture, repetition, and situational signal begins to harden into language. This transition does not erase what came before, it absorbs it. The cognitive systems built across deep prehistory memory embedded in movement, knowledge stored in practice, meaning carried through shared experience do not disappear. They are reorganized. Sound begins to take on a more consistent role as a carrier of reference. A gesture that once meant something only in a specific moment can now be replaced by a sound that holds meaning across multiple contexts. This is not a replacement of systems, but a compression of them into a more efficient medium. Early spoken communication remains deeply tied to environment. Words, in their earliest forms, are likely inseparable from action, emotion, and context. A sound is not an abstract unit. It is still grounded in lived experience. Yet something crucial has changed. Humans are no longer limited to what can be shown. They can begin to indicate what is absent. This ability transforms cognition. Once absence can be referenced, thought is no longer bound to the immediate field of perception. A group can communicate about a location not currently visible, an event not currently unfolding, or a memory shared across time. Coordination expands beyond the present moment into a shared temporal landscape. With this expansion comes a restructuring of social reality. Knowledge is no longer entirely distributed through observation and repetition. It can now be transmitted more directly, more quickly, and with greater precision. This increases the speed at which innovations spread, the reliability of shared practices, and the cohesion of larger groups. Language does not replace earlier systems of communication immediately, but it begins to dominate them. At the same time, abstraction becomes more stable. When sounds can consistently represent objects, actions, or states of being, the mind gains a new tool: symbolic manipulation. Ideas can be combined, compared, and reorganized without physical reference. Thought becomes less tied to the present environment and more capable of constructing internal models of the world. This shift reshapes memory itself. Instead of relying solely on reenactment or spatial association, knowledge can now be encoded in structured sequences of sound. This reduces dependency on physical repetition and allows information to persist across larger groups and longer distances. Memory begins to externalize more fully into shared linguistic systems. Yet even as language stabilizes, it retains traces of its origins. Early linguistic systems are likely irregular, deeply metaphorical, and closely tied to environmental cues. Meaning is still shaped by context, tone, and shared experience. Over time, however, repetition and social necessity push these systems toward greater consistency. Patterns emerge, rules begin to form implicitly. Structure develops not by design, but by repeated use. This is where the foundations of grammar begin to appear not as formal systems, but as habitual patterns of ordering thought in speech. Certain sequences become easier to understand. Certain arrangements of sound become more efficient for communication. Over generations, these preferences solidify into structure. With structured language, storytelling becomes fully realized. Events can now be organized into sequences that extend beyond immediate reenactment. Memory can be shaped into narrative, and narrative can be transmitted independently of direct observation. The world becomes narratable in a way it was not before. Experience can be shared not only as action, but as structured account. This has profound consequences for social organization. Shared narratives reinforce group identity. Collective memory becomes more coherent. Knowledge can be preserved even when individuals are lost. Language allows culture to scale beyond the limits of face-to-face transmission, enabling larger, more complex social structures to emerge. But this transformation is not purely additive. It also reshapes how humans perceive reality. Once the world can be described in stable symbolic form, it becomes possible to think about it in abstract categories that did not previously exist. Time can be segmented, space can be conceptualized, relationships can be defined in more formal terms. The mind begins to operate within a dual framework: immediate experience and symbolic representation. This duality becomes the defining feature of human cognition moving forward. Reality is no longer only what is directly perceived. It is also what can be described, imagined, and shared. Language creates a second layer of existence, one composed not of physical matter, but of structured meaning. Still, this transformation remains incomplete at the edge of prehistory. Language is powerful, but it is not yet fully separated from its origins in gesture, memory, and shared action. It carries within it the echoes of earlier systems, preserving the long history of human adaptation beneath its emerging structure. And so, as the first true forms of spoken communication stabilize, they do not mark the end of prehistory. but its transformation. The same minds that once navigated landscapes through memory and intuition now begin to navigate them through shared symbols. The world is no longer only lived, it is now described, remembered, and reimagined through language. This is the threshold where silence becomes speech, and where thought, for the first time, begins to take a form that can outlive the body that produces it.